March 24, 2014. Linwood Women's Correctional Facility, California. After 11,688 days behind bars, 74-year-old Mary Virginia Jones walked through the prison gates into sunlight she hadn't felt as a free woman since Ronald Reagan was president. She had entered prison at 42 years old. A mother, a survivor of domestic violence, a woman terrorized into participating in a crime she never wanted to commit. She emerged as Mother Mary, a grandmother who had spent more than half her adult life paying for her abuser's sins. For 32 years, the California justice system had insisted that Mary Jones was a cold-blooded killer who deserved to die behind bars. For 32 years, her family fought against a system that refused to acknowledge a simple truth. The real murderer was the man who held a gun to her head and forced her to drive to an alley where he would execute 2 drug dealers in cold blood. This is the story of how America's justice system failed one woman so catastrophically that it took 4 trials, multiple appeals, and a generation of law students to expose the truth. It's a case that reveals how domestic violence victims can become prisoners of both their abusers and a legal system that refuses to understand the psychology of terror. Los Angeles, 1981. Mary Virginia Jones was living in hell, but nobody could see her bruises. At 42, Mary was a mother trying to survive in one of LA's toughest neighborhoods while trapped in a relationship with Mose Willis, a man whose capacity for violence knew no boundaries. Willis controlled every aspect of Mary's life through a campaign of terror that included beatings, threats, and psychological torture designed to break her spirit completely. The week before Mary's life would be destroyed forever, Willis had shot at her daughter, his own twisted way of sending a message that no one Mary loved was safe from his rage. The threat was clear: obey me completely, or watch everyone you care about die. Mary's friends and family would later describe her as a woman who had been systematically destroyed by domestic abuse. The confident, independent person she had once been had been replaced by someone who lived in constant fear, who jumped at every sound, who had learned that survival meant absolute submission to Willis's will. But even her complete surrender wasn't enough to satisfy Willis's need for control. He was planning something that would cement his dominance over Mary forever, something so terrible that it would bind her to him even if she found the courage to leave. On that fateful day in 1981, Willis approached Mary with a plan that revealed the full depths of his evil. He had identified 2 drug dealers who owed him money, and he intended to collect his debt in blood. But he wouldn't be going alone. He was taking Mary with him, whether she wanted to go or not. When Mary hesitated, Willis made his position clear with the barrel of a gun pressed against her head. She would drive him to the meeting, she would follow his orders exactly, and she would keep her mouth shut, or she would join the drug dealers in death. Mary Virginia Jones had become an unwilling participant in her own destruction, terrorized into a crime that would cost her the next 3 decades of her life. The crime that would destroy Mary Jones's life began like so many domestic violence situations, with a woman being forced to choose between her own death and participating in something that violated every moral principle she held. Willis had arranged to meet James Aubrey and Michael Green, 2 men involved in LA's drug trade who had apparently crossed him in some business deal. But this wasn't going to be a negotiation, it was going to be an execution, and Willis intended to use Mary as his unwilling accomplice. Willis allegedly kidnapped 2 men and ordered Jones at gunpoint to drive a car to a back alley where he had planned the murders. Throughout the drive, Willis kept the gun trained on Mary, making it clear that any attempt to escape or resist would result in her immediate death. Mary would later describe the terror of that drive, knowing that she was being forced to participate in something horrible, but understanding that refusal meant death not just for her, but potentially for her children as well. Willis had made it clear over months of abuse that her family's safety depended on her complete obedience. When they reached the isolated alley, Willis's plan unfolded with methodical precision. He forced Aubrey and Green from the car at gunpoint, robbed them of money and drugs, and then opened fire. Willis was later convicted of shooting both men and killing one of them, but Mary was forced to witness the entire execution. The moment the shots rang out, Mary realized that her life as she knew it was over. She had been turned into a witness to murder, an accomplice to robbery, and a victim of circumstances that no jury would ever fully understand. Jones ran from the alley to a friend's house, where she hid for several days before police arrested her. Those few days of freedom would be her last for 32 years. When police finally tracked Mary down, they found a terrified woman who was as much a victim as the men Willis had shot. But the justice system in 1981 had little understanding of domestic violence dynamics, coercive control, or the psychology of abused women who are forced to participate in their abusers' crimes. To prosecutors, Mary Jones looked like a willing accomplice to murder. They saw a woman who had driven the getaway car, who had been present during a robbery, who had fled the scene rather than immediately calling police. They couldn't see, or chose not to see, the gun that had been held to her head, the months of terror that had preceded the crime, or the impossible choice she had been forced to make. The case that should have been about domestic violence and coercive control became a simple murder trial, with Mary cast as a cold-blooded killer rather than a terrorized victim. The prosecution of Mary Virginia Jones revealed every failure of the American justice system's approach to domestic violence in the 1980s. It took 4 trials, including a reversal on appeal and 2 hung juries, to convict Jones. That fact alone should have told prosecutors something was fundamentally wrong with their case. Juries kept refusing to convict because something about the evidence didn't add up. But rather than examining whether they were prosecuting the wrong person, authorities simply kept trying Mary again and again until they finally found a jury willing to ignore the obvious signs of domestic abuse and coercive control. The evidence of Mary's victimization was overwhelming, but it was evidence that the legal system of 1981 wasn't equipped to understand or process. Witnesses could testify that Mary lived in terror of Willis. Medical records could document injuries from his beatings. Friends could describe how her personality had changed under his abuse. But none of that mattered to prosecutors who were determined to secure a conviction for a high-profile murder. They portrayed Mary as an equal partner in Willis's crimes, a woman who had chosen to participate in robbery and murder for financial gain. The prosecution's theory required jurors to believe that a terrified domestic violence victim had suddenly transformed into a ruthless criminal mastermind. It required them to ignore the overwhelming evidence of Willis's violence and control. It required them to accept that Mary had risked her life and freedom for a few $100s in drug money. Most damaging to Mary's case was the legal system's complete failure to understand the psychology of domestic violence. In 1981, courts didn't allow expert testimony about battered woman syndrome, coercive control, or the ways that prolonged abuse can compromise a victim's ability to make free choices. Courts now allow experts to testify about the effects of being battered, according to legal experts who would later work on Mary's case. But in 1981, Mary was on her own, forced to defend herself against murder charges without the legal tools necessary to explain how a victim becomes an unwilling accomplice. The 4th trial finally produced a conviction, but it was a conviction built on the justice system's refusal to acknowledge the realities of domestic violence. Mary Virginia Jones was sentenced to life without parole, effectively a death sentence for a woman who had committed no crime except being too terrorized to resist her abuser's demands. Willis, the actual murderer, was also convicted and sentenced to death. But he would die on death row while Mary continued to serve time for his crimes, a final act of control from beyond the grave. From 1982 to 2014, Mary Virginia Jones became a ghost in the California prison system, a woman whose case had been forgotten by everyone except the family who refused to give up fighting for her freedom. The early years of Mary's incarceration were marked by a series of appeals that revealed the legal system's continued refusal to acknowledge the role of domestic violence in her conviction. Appeal after appeal was denied, often with cursory reviews that failed to address the fundamental injustice of her situation. Mary's family, particularly her children, who had lost their mother to a system that refused to see her as a victim, became her advocates, their voices in the wilderness calling for justice that seemed impossibly distant. They wrote letters to attorneys, contacted journalists, and searched for anyone who might understand that Mary was serving time for someone else's crimes. But the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s brought little progress in society's understanding of domestic violence. The legal precedents that might have freed Mary didn't exist yet. The cultural awareness that might have generated sympathy for her case hadn't developed. And the political will to re-examine questionable convictions was virtually non-existent. Known as Mother Mary to family and friends, Mary established herself as a stabilizing presence in whatever prison she was housed. She became a mentor to younger inmates, a grandmother figure who provided comfort and wisdom to women struggling with their own demons. But even as Mary built a new life within the confines of prison, she never stopped maintaining her innocence or hoping for justice. Letters to family members, prison records, and later interviews would reveal a woman who had accepted her circumstances but never accepted the validity of her conviction. The California justice system seemed content to let Mary Jones die in prison, another forgotten victim of a case that had been officially closed for decades. If not for a group of law students who would stumble across her case in the 2010s, Mary Virginia Jones might have remained buried in the system until her death. The institutional indifference that kept Mary imprisoned for decades wasn't malicious, it was worse than that. It was bureaucratic, systematic, and utterly indifferent to the possibility that a grave injustice had been committed and was being perpetuated every day she remained behind bars. University of Southern California Gould School of Law. A group of law students working with the Post-Conviction Justice Project were reviewing old cases when they discovered the file of Mary Virginia Jones, a 74-year-old woman who had been in prison for over 30 years for a murder committed by her abuser. The students, led by professors who specialized in wrongful conviction cases, immediately recognized that Mary's case represented everything wrong with the justice system's historical approach to domestic violence. Here was a clear example of a woman who had been terrorized into unwilling participation in a crime, then punished as if she were an equal partner in murder. But recognizing an injustice and correcting it are two very different things. The students faced the daunting task of overturning a 30-year-old conviction in a legal system that strongly resists admitting its mistakes. The first challenge was gathering evidence that had been scattered across decades and multiple jurisdictions. Police reports from 1981 had to be located and analyzed. Witness statements had to be tracked down. Medical records documenting Mary's abuse had to be assembled into a coherent narrative. More challenging was the need to present Mary's case using legal theories that hadn't existed at the time of her conviction. The law students argued that Jones, known as Mother Mary, would not have been convicted if the jury had heard expert testimony about the abuse she suffered. The students had to prove not just that Mary was innocent, but that her conviction had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. They had to show that the 1981 jury had been denied crucial information about domestic violence that would have changed their verdict. Working pro bono, spending countless hours on a case that offered no financial reward, the USC law students began building the most comprehensive challenge to Mary's conviction that had ever been mounted. They interviewed Mary extensively, documenting decades of consistent statements about her victimization. They researched changes in domestic violence law that supported their arguments. They prepared expert testimony about battered woman syndrome and coercive control. But perhaps most importantly, they refused to accept that 30 years of injustice was too much to overcome. While the legal system had forgotten Mary Virginia Jones, these students were determined to force it to remember. The case that the USC law students built for Mary Virginia Jones wasn't just about legal technicalities or procedural errors. It was about fundamental human justice that had been denied for 3 decades. Willis forced Jones at gunpoint to participate in the robbery and kidnapping. She ran down the alley fully expecting him to shoot and kill her, too, according to the legal team's analysis of the evidence. This wasn't the behavior of a willing accomplice. It was the desperate flight of a woman who knew she had narrowly escaped death. The students uncovered evidence that painted a devastating picture of prosecutorial tunnel vision and judicial indifference to domestic violence. 1 week before the crime, Willis shot at Jones' daughter and threatened to kill her, clear evidence of the level of terror that Willis used to control Mary. But this crucial evidence had been minimized or ignored during Mary's original trials. The prosecutors had focused on Mary's presence at the crime scene while dismissing the coercive circumstances that had put her there. The legal team also discovered that advances in understanding domestic violence had fundamentally changed how courts evaluated cases like Mary's. Courts now allow experts to testify about the effects of being battered, providing context for behavior that might otherwise seem suspicious or incriminating. Expert testimony prepared for Mary's case explained how prolonged domestic abuse creates a psychological condition where victims comply with their abusers' demands not out of criminal intent, but out of well-founded fear for their lives. Mary's decision to drive Willis to the crime scene wasn't evidence of criminal conspiracy, it was evidence of successful terrorist conditioning. The students also uncovered evidence that Willis had a pattern of using women as unwilling accomplices in his crimes. Mary wasn't his first victim, and she probably wouldn't have been his last if he hadn't been caught and eventually executed. The students, members of USC's Post-Conviction Justice Project, asked the DA's office to conduct an independent investigation into Mary's case. That request represented more than just legal strategy. It was a challenge to the entire system to acknowledge that a grave injustice had been committed and needed to be corrected. The evidence compiled by the law students didn't just suggest that Mary was innocent, it screamed that she had been wrongfully convicted and had spent 32 years paying for her abuser's crimes. March 24, 2014. Los Angeles Superior Court. After 32 years, 1 month and 3 days in prison, Mary Virginia Jones was about to experience something she had almost stopped believing in: justice. After spending more than 3 decades behind bars, Mary Virginia Jones is finally free. The words that had seemed impossible for so long were finally being spoken by a judge who had reviewed the evidence and reached the only conclusion that justice would allow. A judge ruled on Monday that she would be released for a murder which was committed by her abusive boyfriend, Mose Willis, who died while on death row. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The real killer had died years earlier while Mary continued to serve his sentence. The courtroom was packed with family members who had waited decades for this moment. Dozens of family and friends were present to witness Mary's vindication and freedom. Children who had grown up without their grandmother, grandchildren who had only known her through prison visits, relatives who had never stopped believing in her innocence, all were there to welcome Mary home. But the emotional weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. Mary had entered prison as a relatively young woman and was leaving as an elderly grandmother. She had missed weddings, births, graduations, and funerals. She had lost decades of life that could never be recovered or replaced. The judge's decision represented more than just Mary's individual freedom. It was an acknowledgement that the justice system had failed catastrophically and needed to do better in cases involving domestic violence. The ruling implicitly criticized the original prosecutors, the judges who had presided over her multiple trials, and the appellate courts that had refused to see the obvious injustice. After serving 32 years in prison for a crime her family says she did not commit, 74-year-old Mary Jones was released from the Linwood Women's Facility in California last Tuesday and has declared that she doesn't have a reason to be bitter. Mary's response to her freedom revealed the extraordinary character of a woman who had survived 3 decades of imprisonment without losing her humanity, her faith, or her capacity for forgiveness. Mary Virginia Jones walked out of Linwood Women's Correctional Facility into a world that had changed beyond recognition during her 32 years of imprisonment. Cell phones, the internet, social media, GPS navigation, technology that seemed like science fiction when she was convicted was now part of everyday life. But more importantly, society's understanding of domestic violence had evolved dramatically. The legal theories that might have freed Mary in 1981 now existed. Courts routinely heard expert testimony about battered woman syndrome and coercive control. Prosecutors were trained to recognize when domestic violence victims had been forced to participate in their abusers' crimes. Mary's case became a symbol of how far the justice system had come and how far it still needed to go. Her exoneration highlighted the need for review of other cases where domestic violence victims might be serving time for crimes committed by their abusers. "I don't have a reason to be bitter. God is my shepherd," Mary declared upon her release. Her words revealed a spiritual strength that had sustained her through decades of injustice and offered a model of grace that inspired everyone who heard her story. But Mary's freedom also raised uncomfortable questions about compensation and accountability. How do you compensate someone for 32 years of stolen life? How do you restore decades of lost relationships, missed opportunities, and broken dreams? How do you hold accountable the system that perpetuated such a profound injustice? The USC law students who had fought for Mary's freedom didn't stop working when she was released. They used her case as a teaching tool, training new generations of lawyers to recognize and challenge wrongful convictions involving domestic violence. Mary's story also became part of the broader conversation about criminal justice reform, prison conditions, and the need for better understanding of domestic violence dynamics in legal proceedings. But perhaps most importantly, Mary's case demonstrated the power of persistence, compassion, and the belief that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. The law students who refused to accept that 32 years of wrongful imprisonment was irreversible proved that individual advocates can still make a difference in a system that often seems impersonal and indifferent. Today, Mary Virginia Jones lives quietly with family members, trying to rebuild relationships and create new memories after losing more than 3 decades to wrongful imprisonment. At 84 years old, she represents both a victory for justice and a stark reminder of how catastrophically the system can fail. The institutional failures that kept Mary imprisoned for 32 years weren't the result of malicious conspiracy, they were the product of systemic blindness to domestic violence, prosecutorial tunnel vision, and a legal system that resisted admitting its mistakes. Mary's case led to significant reforms in how California handles cases involving domestic violence and coercive control. Prosecutors now receive training on recognizing when abuse victims have been forced to participate in crimes. Defense attorneys have better tools for presenting expert testimony about the psychology of domestic violence. And appellate courts are more willing to reconsider convictions that may have been based on inadequate understanding of abuse dynamics. The USC Post-Conviction Justice Project continues to use Mary's case as a template for challenging other wrongful convictions. Her story has helped free additional victims of domestic violence who were serving time for crimes committed by their abusers. But no amount of legal reform can restore the 32 years that Mary lost to wrongful imprisonment. She missed seeing her children grow up, missed being present for the births of grandchildren, missed decades of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that make up a life. Mose Willis, the man whose violence destroyed multiple lives, died on death row without ever being held accountable for the additional crime of manipulating the justice system into imprisoning his victim. His death meant that Mary's exoneration couldn't be accompanied by any acknowledgement of responsibility from the person who had orchestrated her suffering. The financial cost of Mary's wrongful conviction, including the cost of 4 trials, 32 years of imprisonment, and the legal resources required for her exoneration, ran into millions of dollars. But the human cost was incalculable. Mary's story serves as a reminder that domestic violence doesn't end when the physical abuse stops. It can continue through manipulation of legal systems, through coercive control that extends into courtrooms, and through the ongoing trauma inflicted on entire families. The law students who fought for Mary's freedom demonstrated something crucial about the American justice system. It's not perfect, but it can be corrected when dedicated advocates refuse to accept injustice. Their work proved that even the most entrenched wrongful convictions can be overturned when people are willing to fight for truth.